Picture the most famous painting of Emperor Commodus you have ever seen. The one in every textbook, every documentary, every historical drama. He is wearing a lionskin draped over his shoulders. He holds a club. His expression is glazed, self-satisfied, almost bovine.
The caption underneath, or the voiceover above, always delivers the same verdict. Here is the man who destroyed Rome's golden age. Here is the narcissist who thought he was Hercules reborn. Here is what happens when a great man, Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, the last truly good emperor, produces a son. You have seen that portrait. You have accepted that portrait. Now forget everything attached to it, because the portrait was assembled by the men who had Commodus strangled in his bath. What you are about to hear is not the version Rome's senatorial aristocracy wanted preserved. It is the version they spent 2,000 years burying under polished marble and selective quotation. The version that survives in the gaps between the accounts they controlled, in the economic records that contradict their testimony, and in the simple question that nobody who repeats the standard story ever bothers to ask.
If Commodus was so obviously, catastrophically insane, why did it take 12 years and a palace conspiracy involving his own mistress, his personal trainer, and a hired wrestler to finally kill him? That question is the crack in the portrait.
And once you see it, the entire image collapses. If you have ever suspected that the history you were taught had been through a political editing process before it reached you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We are about to go somewhere textbooks have never taken you.
The year is 180 Anno Domini. Marcus Aurelius is dying on campaign near the Danube. He has ruled for 19 years with a philosopher's discipline and a general's practicality. And the empire he leaves behind is the largest, wealthiest, most administratively complex organism in the ancient world.
He leaves it to his son, Commodus, who is 18 years old. Here is what the standard account gives you next. Commodus immediately abandoned the Danubian campaign his father had been prosecuting, proof of military cowardice and strategic incompetence. He returned to Rome and began the long, deranged slide into narcissism that would define his reign. Here is what the standard account quietly omits.
The peace treaty Commodus negotiated with the Marcomanni and Quadi tribes on the Danube was not, by the military and political standards of the time, an unreasonable settlement. The war had dragged on for years. The treasury was under strain.
Several of his father's own advisors supported withdrawal. Historians who are not working from the senatorial sources, who look at the economic and administrative records, describe the treaty as pragmatic rather than cowardly. The first layer of the Commodus myth is that every decision he made was evidence of instability. But when you remove the interpretive lens his enemies installed, a different pattern emerges.
A young emperor inheriting an exhausted war machine, making a territorial calculation that secured a northern border, and returning to the center of power to consolidate his position. That is not madness. That is standard imperial practice. But let us go deeper. Let us go past the political record and into the physical reality that no history book ever bothers to reconstruct. Picture Rome in 180 CE. Not the Rome of film sets and CGI marble, the actual Rome. A city of approximately 1 million people crammed into an urban density that no pre-modern sanitation system could adequately address. The streets between the great monuments are narrow, dark, and permanently damp with runoff that carries a smell you would recognize in your body before your brain could name it. Organic waste, animal refuse, the sour reek of the garum fish sauce that permeates every social class of Roman cooking, and underneath all of it, something more fundamental.
Human bodies, unwashed by modern standards, in heavy wool clothing that holds moisture and microbes in equal measure. The Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace sprawls across the summit, is elevated above the worst of this.
The air moves more freely at height, but the palace itself is its own biological ecosystem. Think about what a Roman imperial palace actually is. It is a structure designed for visibility and control, which means it is also a structure that concentrates hundreds of people, slaves, freedmen,
guards, courtiers, petitioners, servants, physicians, entertainers, into a shared physical space where privacy is architecturally impossible, and contagion moves with the efficiency of rumor. The water in the great cisterns beneath the Palatine is delivered through lead-lined aqueduct pipes that have been in service for over a century. The Romans knew lead was toxic to varying degrees. They called the pale, wasted look of lead exposure plumbism, which is where we get the word plumber. But the infrastructure was sunk, the cost of replacement was prohibitive, and the medical understanding of cumulative low-level exposure did not exist in any form they could act on. Every emperor who ruled from the Palatine drank from those pipes. Every emperor who ate from the kitchens beneath that palace ate food prepared in lead-lined cookware, stored in lead-sealed amphorae, seasoned with sauces that had been reduced in lead vessels to concentrate their sweetness. This is not speculation. Modern toxicological analysis of Roman skeletal remains from elite contexts consistently shows bone lead concentrations that would be classified as chronic poisoning by any contemporary medical standard. The wealthier the Roman, the more lead they consumed, because lead was predominantly a feature of preserved food, fine wine, and the water infrastructure of palatial buildings. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, died at 58 of what the sources describe as a wasting illness after years of stomach complaints, chronic fatigue, and what contemporary accounts document as increasing difficulty thinking clearly in his final years. His son Commodus grew up in that same palace, drinking from the same pipes, eating from the same kitchens, from infancy to adulthood. Nobody in the standard Commodus account ever asks what was happening to his neurology. Here is what we know from modern toxicology about chronic lead exposure from childhood. It does not produce the dramatic, movie-ready symptoms of acute poisoning. It produces something more insidious and more difficult to separate from personality. Increased impulsivity, difficulty regulating emotional responses, grandiosity and an elevated sense of self-importance, periods of irrational confidence followed by paranoid suspicion. Difficulty maintaining sustained rational decision-making under pressure. Read that list again. Then go back to every account of Commodus's behavior and read it through that lens, rather than the born bad son of a good father lens that the senatorial sources installed. The grandiosity is there. The impulsivity is there. The paranoia that intensified across his reign is there. The alternating periods of apparent rationality and spectacular irrationality are there. But none of the ancient historians who documented his behavior were asking biological questions. They were asking political ones. And the political answer, he was simply corrupt, simply mad, simply the wrong man for the imperial throne, served their purposes far better than the medical answer. The portrait had a function, and that function was not historical accuracy. Now let us go inside the Hercules mythology, because this is the element that every telling of the Commodus story treats as the clearest evidence of his insanity. The emperor who renamed himself after a Greek demigod, who appeared in the arena dressed in a lionskin and carrying a club, who demanded that Rome rename itself Commodiana in his honor. Here is what the textbook framing never acknowledges. The identification of Roman emperors with divine or semi-divine figures was not invented by Commodus. It was standard political theology. Augustus had identified himself with Apollo. Hadrian had cultivated the image of a Hellenistic philosopher king, complete with the Greek-style beard that became imperial fashion for generations. Marcus Aurelius himself had been elevated by the senatorial class to something approaching philosophical sainthood during his own reign. The Roman imperial system had no clear separation between political authority and divine sanction. The emperor's power rested partly on the claim that he occupied a unique position between the human and the sacred. What Commodus did differently was choose Hercules rather than Jupiter or Sol Invictus, and the choice was not random. Hercules was specifically the demigod of the common people, the laborer, the wrestler, the man who descended into the underworld and came back, who served, suffered, and prevailed through physical rather than aristocratic virtue. When Commodus appeared in the arena in the Herculean costume, the lion skin, the club, he was making a political statement to the Roman plebs that bypassed the senatorial class entirely. Think about what this means for the standard narrative. The man whom the senators described as criminally insane for identifying with Hercules was using the Hercules mythology as a direct political communication to the population segment whose support did not flow through senatorial networks.
The gladiatorial performances were not the delusions of a man who had lost touch with reality. They were the reality of a ruler who had decided his power base was the Roman crowd, rather than the Roman aristocracy. That was a threatening position, threatening to very specific people, the people who wrote the history.
If what you are hearing is starting to make the Commodus you learned about feel like a politically constructed image rather than a historical portrait, like this video so others can see what their textbooks chose not to show them.
Let us go further into the physical reality. Let us enter the arena itself, because the gladiatorial performances are described in the sources in a way that requires some forensic attention.
The standard account presents Commodus as fighting in the arena as evidence of imperial degradation. A Roman emperor reducing himself to the status of a common gladiator, the lowest social caste in Rome, was proof that something had gone badly wrong inside his mind.
Cassius Dio, who is the primary source for most of what we know about Commodus's arena activities, describes performances in which the emperor killed animals, fought opponents who were obviously not trying to harm him, and accepted acclaim from the crowd. Here's what Cassius Dio was when he wrote those accounts. He was a senator. He was present for some of the performances he describes. And he wrote his history of the period after Commodus had been assassinated, after the Senate had officially declared damnatio memorae, the formal erasure and condemnation of Commodus's memory, and after the new regime had every political incentive to ensure that the historical record confirmed the assassination had been necessary and justified. Damnatio memoriae was not metaphorical. The Senate ordered Commodus's statues destroyed, his name chiseled off public inscriptions, his official acts declared null and void. The physical infrastructure of historical memory was being systematically dismantled by political decision, and the man writing the history that would survive was doing so inside that political environment, as a member of the class that had ordered the erasure. Now consider the actual mechanics of the arena performances as described. Commodus fought in the mornings, before the main events. The opponents he faced were reportedly armed with wooden or lead-weighted weapons that could not actually harm him. The animals he killed, bears, lions, ostriches, were released into a space where they had no effective means of escape or counterattack. The crowd that cheered him was a Roman crowd, which means a crowd that understood theatrical political performance in ways that modern audiences, trained to treat spectacle and sincerity as opposites, often misread. Was this gladiatorial combat? No. Was it delusional? Or was it a calculated piece of popular theater designed to be seen, to be talked about, to circulate through the city as evidence that the emperor was physically present, physically dominant, physically on the side of the crowd, rather than sequestered in the aristocratic world of the Palatine? The smell of the arena on a Roman morning is something the textbooks have never asked you to reconstruct. Blood is the obvious one. The metallic, copper-sharp smell that coats the back of your throat and does not leave easily. But the arena also smells of animal. Large carnivores in close confinement have a particular biological reality, a dense musk that combines with the ammonia of waste and the heat of massed bodies into something that the refined senatorial class, with their perfumed togas and carefully managed domestic environments, would have found deeply offensive. Commodus was standing in it, performing in it, getting it on him. That was the point. Here's the thing that the portrait never shows you. The senators did not just find the arena performances eccentric or embarrassing. They found them politically destabilizing. An emperor who smelled like the crowd, who sweated in public like a working man, who accepted the adulation of the plebs in a medium that explicitly excluded aristocratic participation, that was an emperor who was building a power base that did not need the Senate to mediate between him and the Roman people. That was genuinely dangerous, not to Rome, to the Senate. Now, let us address the paranoia, because by the final years of his reign, Commodus was demonstrably executing senators, restructuring the bureaucratic command structure around freedmen and palace officials rather than the traditional aristocratic networks, and had developed what the sources describe as an obsessive preoccupation with assassination plots. Here is the complicating fact.
There actually were assassination plots. In 182 Anno Domini, his own sister Lucilla, together with a group of senators, orchestrated an assassination attempt in which a hired agent confronted Commodus in a passageway, reportedly announced his intention while drawing a weapon, and was subdued before delivering the blow.
The failure of the attempt led to executions, which the sources present as evidence of tyrannical paranoia. But the attempt had been real. The conspiracy had been real.
The men executed in its aftermath were, in at least some cases, genuinely involved. When a ruler responds to a documented assassination attempt by increasing security, restructuring access to his person, and becoming less trusting of the class from which the conspirators came, we typically call that rational threat assessment.
When we have already decided the ruler is mad, we call it paranoid tyranny. The question is not whether Commodus became more suspicious across his reign. He clearly did.
The question is whether a ruler who had survived at least one documented attempt on his life in an environment where the sources themselves acknowledge multiple conspiracy scares was responding to a real threat environment or manufacturing an imaginary one.
The modern psychological concept of hypervigilance describes a state in which a person who has experienced genuine threat begins to perceive threat in neutral or ambiguous situations. It is a clinically recognized response to real danger.
It is not the same as paranoid delusion, though from the outside, especially when written by people who are simultaneously planning the next attempt, it can be described that way. Cassius Dio was in Rome during these years. He was a senator. He was watching men from his class being executed. He had every personal reason to describe those executions as evidence of madness rather than evidence of a ruler who had accurate information about where the threats were coming from. Let us go into the body one more time, because the biology of Commodus's final period is instructive. By 1992 CE, 12 years into his reign, Commodus was in his late 20s.
The sources describe a man who has grown physically imposing. Contemporary accounts mention his athletic build, the hours spent in training and combat practice, and the deliberate cultivation of a physique that matched the Herculean image he was projecting.
But they also describe increasing erratic behavior, sudden rages, and a quality of decision-making that swings between calculating and unhinged. Chronic lead poisoning does not plateau, it accumulates. 12 years of additional exposure on a neurological foundation that had been absorbing the compound since childhood would, by modern toxicological modeling, produce exactly the deteriorating pattern the sources describe in his later reign. Not the flatline lunacy of a born monster, but the escalating instability of a nervous system under sustained chemical siege. There is also the question of what was being done to him medically. Roman medicine in the imperial period relied heavily on theriac, a compound antidote to poison that contained, among hundreds of ingredients, opium in quantities that would, by modern standards, constitute a significant narcotic dose. Emperors who were paranoid about being poisoned, which by the late 2nd century was a reasonable paranoia given the actual historical record of imperial poisonings, often consumed theriac prophylactically. The interaction between chronic lead toxicity and regular opiate consumption in a brain that had been exposed to both since childhood produces a pharmacological and neurological profile that the ancient world had no framework for understanding, and the modern world would recognize as a serious clinical emergency.
Commodus was not simply mad. He was a patient being destroyed by the intersection of environmental toxicity, medical treatment, genuine threat, and the impossible biological demands of performing divinity for 12 years without a moment of privacy, rest, or honest counsel.
The tragedy of the image is always this: the mask requires more effort than the face beneath it can sustain.
Now let us examine what happened to the historical record after his death, because this is where the iconoclast structure of this story becomes completely explicit. Commodus was strangled on the night of December 31, 192 CE,
by a wrestler named Narcissus, who was hired for the purpose by a conspiracy that included his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus.
The Senate, informed the following morning, immediately voted damnatio memoriae. Within hours of his death, the apparatus of historical erasure was operating.
His statues were torn down. His name was removed from inscriptions. You can still see the chisel marks on monuments throughout Rome and the provinces, the rectangular shadows where Commodus used to be.
The months of the year he had renamed after himself were restored to their original names. His official acts were, in principle, invalidated.
And the men who survived him began writing the accounts that you have been reading ever since. The Historia Augusta, the primary collection of imperial biographies covering Commodus, is so compromised as a source that modern historians have spent decades arguing about its basic reliability.
It is almost certainly a composite document written by multiple authors, probably centuries after the events it describes, and assembled from both genuine sources and outright fabrication in proportions that cannot now be reliably separated. The biography of Commodus in the Historia Augusta reads in places like a political prosecution rather than a historical account. Cassius Dio is more reliable but not neutral. He was present. He had opinions. He was a senator. He survived by navigating a court environment that punished honest assessment and rewarded the correct interpretation of events. Herodian, the third major source, wrote decades after the events and explicitly states that he is writing history from memory and public knowledge rather than documentary access. These are the sources. This is the evidentiary foundation on which the standard portrait rests. Here is what the portrait does not have: the administrative records that would show how the empire actually functioned under Commodus's rule, which was, by most measures, not the catastrophic collapse the sources imply. The economic data, which shows no dramatic deterioration during his reign compared to the period immediately following it.
The provincial records do not describe the breakdown in governance that the senatorial accounts suggest. The correspondence of officials in the field, who, during the Commodus period, write letters that describe an empire operating within its normal dysfunction parameters, not an empire in terminal crisis.
The empire that the sources described as being destroyed by Commodus survived his death by nearly 3 centuries.
The immediate period after his assassination, the year of the 5 emperors, the auction of the throne by the Praetorian Guard, the civil wars that shredded the political stability Marcus Aurelius had worked 2 decades to build, that was the catastrophe. And it was caused not by Commodus, but by the vacuum his assassination created and the political dynamics his killers unleashed. The men who murdered Commodus did not save Rome.
They broke something that took 300 years to fully collapse, and they wrote the history that told you the murder was salvation. Now you can never look at the portrait the same way. Think about what it means that the statues with the lionskin were destroyed within hours of his death. Think about the men with chisels working through the night to remove a name from stone before anyone could object, before any alternative account could form, before the crowd that had cheered him in the arena could organize around a different verdict. The physical urgency of the erasure tells you something about how afraid the Senate was of the counter-narrative. You did not destroy statues at midnight because the man they represent was simply eccentric.
You destroy statues at midnight because his face, still present on public monuments in the morning light, is an argument you cannot win in daylight. Here is the final layer of what the portrait conceals.
In 195 CE, 3 years after the assassination, the Emperor Septimius Severus, one of the men who eventually emerged from the chaos the assassination caused, officially rehabilitated Commodus. He declared him divine, consecrated him, and formally reversed the damnatio memoriae. Why would a new emperor rehabilitate a man universally described as a catastrophic lunatic? Because Septimius Severus needed the political legitimacy that came from being the successor to the Antonine line. Because the army, the soldiers who had served under Commodus, who had been paid regularly under Commodus, who had not experienced their emperor as a catastrophe, responded better to an emperor who honored their previous commander than to one who confirmed the senatorial verdict. Because the popular memory of Commodus, the memory that existed outside the senatorial record, was not uniformly negative.
The people who rewrote his legacy were not the Roman people. They were the class of men who felt most threatened by him. The class of men who benefited most from his removal. The class of men who controlled what got written down, what got preserved, and what eventually reached you in a textbook, presented as settled historical fact. You have spent your life looking at a portrait that was painted the night he was killed.
Now you know who held the brush. If this changed how you see the history they taught you, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Every week, we go back behind the official image and show you what the people who built it needed you not to see.
Drop a comment below. Which historical figure do you think is hiding the most behind their iconic portrait? Which emperor, which king, which legendary name do you want us to deconstruct next? The version of history that gets passed down is always the version that someone needed to survive.
The question is always, survived for whom? Commodus's statues were destroyed. His name was chiseled off stone. His months were renamed.
And 2,000 years later, you still learn the story that the men holding the chisels want you to know. That is how durable a well-executed lie can be.
That is what a portrait without a smell, without a body, without a political context, without a question about who assembled it and why, that is what it can do to a human being's place in history.
The lionskin is still there. The club is still raised. But now you know what was underneath it.